Hey everyone, and welcome back to Toxic HOA, the only channel brave enough to expose the real nightmares lurking behind those manicured lawns and cheerful community signs. If you've ever felt trapped, bullied, or just plain wronged by your homeowners association, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into a story that proves what we always say. When an HOA goes rogue, the homeowners can fight back, and sometimes they win big. So hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and get ready for a tale of defiance, strategy, and ultimate payback. Because the HOA committee, they got what was coming to them. This is the HOA committee. Got its punishment, a homeowner's revenge. The little house on Primrose Lane had been everything Mark Jenkins dreamed of. A quaint two-story bungalow with a welcoming porch swing, a small, vibrant yard perfect for his beloved rose bushes, a passion he'd cultivated since childhood, and enough space to finally stretch out after years spent squeezed into a cramped city apartment. The brochures for the Willow Creek Estates community had painted a picture of idyllic suburban bliss, tree-lined streets where children could safely ride bikes, friendly neighbors waving from their porches, a sparkling community pool promising lazy summer afternoons, and best of all, the unwavering promise of perfectly maintained common areas thanks to the Homeowners Association. Willow Creek Estates, the tagline read, where community thrives and peace resides. The HOA ensures property values stay high and the neighborhood remains beautiful, the real estate agent had chirped, her smile almost as wide as the manicured entrance. She'd handed him a thick binder of bylaws, a document dense with legal jargon and endless clauses. Mark, eager to settle down, to finally put down roots after years of urban transient life, had skimmed them. They seemed reasonable enough. Rules about trash cans, lawn care schedules, approved exterior paint palettes. Standard stuff, he figured. The necessary bureaucratic hum behind the symphony of suburban perfection. He signed the papers with a hopeful flourish, oblivious to the discordant notes waiting to be struck. He couldn't have been more wrong. The first hint of trouble arrived less than a month after he moved in, before all his boxes were even unpacked. It was a formal letter, stiff and impersonal, citing him for non-compliance, unapproved shrubbery placement. Mark stared incredulously at the healthy, blooming azalea bush he'd lovingly planted just beside his porch. It was perfectly within his property line, well-maintained, thriving, and frankly, a beautiful splash of vibrant pink against the bungalow's muted siding. He called the HOA office, expecting a quick clarification, a friendly apology for the misunderstanding. Instead, he got Agnes Periwinkle, the HOA committee's secretary and self-appointed chief enforcer. Her voice, when it answered, was as sharp and unyielding as a freshly starched shirt. "Mr. Jenkins," Agnes's voice clipped through the phone line, devoid of warmth. "All landscaping additions, no matter how minor you perceive them to be, require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Your azalea bush was not approved. It's a violation. You have 7 calendar days to remove it from the common visible area of your property or face a $50 daily fine, escalating after 10 days of non-compliance." Mark's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "It's a small bush, and it's practically identical to ones already planted by the developer along the main entrance. I don't understand." "The rules apply equally to everyone, Mr. Jenkins," Agnes countered, her voice dripping with an almost relishable self-importance, as if she were delivering a profound legal judgment. No exceptions, no special dispensations. This is how we maintain order and aesthetic integrity in Willow Creek Estates. She hung up before he could argue further. Reluctantly, fuming internally, Mark dug up the azalea. He tried to tell himself it was just a minor misunderstanding, a quirky, albeit annoying, aspect of suburban living. He rationalized that perhaps there was some obscure ecological reason or a future community plan, but deep down, a knot of resentment began to form, tightening with each shovel of dirt. He was sacrificing a piece of his new home, not for safety or community benefit, but for bureaucratic rigidity. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was the first skirmish in what would become an all-out war for his peace of mind and the soul of Willow Creek Estates. The Willow Creek Estates HOA committee was a self-perpetuating oligarchy, a small, insulated clique that had gradually consolidated power over the years. They operated with an almost feudal arrogance, convinced of their own infallible judgment. It was dominated by three figures, each a caricature of petty authoritarianism. Arthur Vance, the president. A retired corporate executive from a notoriously cutthroat industry, Arthur brought a penchant for micromanagement and a sneering disregard for anyone not in his inner circle to the HOA. He saw the community as his personal corporation to run, its residents as unruly subordinates. His booming voice and condescending tone were his primary tools of intimidation. He believed in absolute control and reveled in the fear he inspired. Agnes Periwinkle, the secretary, a woman whose meticulously coiffed hair and perfectly pressed clothes masked a petty vindictiveness and a deep-seated insecurity. Agnes relished her role as the committee's chief enforcer, finding solace and validation in wielding rules like weapons. She had a photographic memory for minor infractions and an uncanny ability to discover new, obscure bylaws to weaponize against those who crossed her. Her smile rarely reached her eyes, which were constantly scanning for imperfections. Richard "Rick" Dawson, the treasurer, a slick former car salesman whose charm was as superficial as his commitment to transparency. Rick managed the HOA's finances with an unnerving lack of oversight, always quick to dismiss questions about budget overruns or unexplained line items. He was the committee's financial enabler, finding creative ways to justify spending that always seemed to benefit Arthur's agenda or his own back pocket. He had a talent for making complicated financial reports even more indecipherable. Their meetings were closed-door affairs, held in a private room at the local bank, not the community center. Their decisions were handed down like divine edicts, often communicated through terse, threatening letters that left homeowners bewildered and intimidated. Their enforcement policies were as arbitrary as they were aggressive, applied with a chilling inconsistency that favored friends and punished perceived enemies. Over the next few months, the letters piled up on Mark's counter like unwelcome stacks of bad news. Each one a fresh assault on his peace, a fine for his garbage can being visible on a Tuesday afternoon. It was precisely positioned for Wednesday morning collection, but apparently it was visible too early according to Agnes's precise self-defined timeline. A warning followed by a fine about excessive rose growth because his prize-winning climbing roses, which brought compliments from genuine neighbors, occasionally brushed against the sidewalk during a particularly verdant week. a demand to repaint his perfectly acceptable navy blue front door to approved colonial teal, even though 3 other houses on his street, owned by Agnes's Bridge Club friends, proudly sported various distinct shades of blue doors, none of them colonial teal. Each time, Mark swallowed his anger, a bitter pill that tasted of injustice. He complied, paying the escalating fines because fighting back meant more letters, more fines, and the ominous, terrifying threat of a lien on his home, a legal claim that could eventually lead to foreclosure. The cost of legal counsel often far outweighed the fines, a brutal catch-22 designed to crush dissent. The committee's reign wasn't just about petty rules, it was about absolute control, an insidious form of psychological warfare. They seemed to relish their power, using the HOA as their personal fiefdom, a tiny kingdom where their word was law. Neighbors whispered nervously about the committee in hushed tones, as if discussing an unspeakable evil. Old Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, frail lady who had lived in Willow Creek for 50 years, her house a comforting fixture of the community, was fined into oblivion. Her crime? Her grandson, visiting for the summer, had parked his beat-up but perfectly legal truck in her driveway for more than 48 hours without a guest permit. The permit, of course, cost an exorbitant $100. When Mrs. Henderson, living on a meager pension, couldn't pay, they escalated, threatening to tow the truck and eventually put a lien on her house, a direct threat to her ability to live in her own home. It was predatory, plain and simple, squeezing the most vulnerable. The breaking point for Mark came with the tree removal mandate. Willow Creek Estates was known for its majestic, century-old oak trees, towering sentinels that provided deep shade and gave the neighborhood a timeless, established character. One of these, a grand old oak, stood proudly in Mark's front yard, its massive branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. It was healthy, vibrant, teeming with life, and a beloved focal point of his property, casting dappled sunlight on his roses. Then a letter arrived, cold and decisive, delivered by Agnes herself with a triumphant smirk. Notice of mandatory tree removal. Oak tree, 12 Primrose Lane. Due to its size and age, the committee has deemed this tree a potential liability. There had been no prior consultation, no community meeting, no explanation. They simply demanded he pay for its removal within 30 days, an estimated cost of $5,000, an astronomical sum, or face escalating fines and removal by the HOA at his expense, with the bill then attached to his property. Mark was devastated. This wasn't a bush, this was a living landmark, a silent witness to generations. He loved that tree. He called the HOA, demanding answers. But Arthur Vance merely chuckled, his voice echoing with dismissive authority. "It's for the safety of the community, Mr. Jenkins. Our arborist advised it, non-negotiable." Mark suspected the arborist was either non-existent, a close friend of Arthur's, or paid to give the desired answer. Driven by desperation, he even hired his own certified independent arborist, a highly respected professional who confirmed in writing that the tree was perfectly healthy, showed no signs of disease or instability, and posed no danger whatsoever. He presented the detailed expert report to the HOA. They dismissed it with a curt, single-sentence email, citing their own expert opinion and reiterating the deadline. This wasn't just about fines anymore. It was an act of pure, unadulterated malice, a power play designed to break his spirit and assert absolute dominance over every aspect of his life, even the trees on his own land. Mark realized he wasn't just a homeowner in a community. He was a tenant in his own property, subject to the arbitrary, vindictive whims of three tyrannical individuals. The fear, the simmering frustration, the quiet compliance he'd maintained for months evaporated in that moment, replaced by a cold, burning resolve that felt like steel in his veins. "They just messed with the wrong homeowner," Mark muttered to his reflection in the dimly lit hallway, his knuckles white as he crumpled the latest threatening letter, the paper crackling like dry leaves. His revenge wouldn't be violent, nor would it be petty. It would be meticulous, legal, devastatingly effective, and entirely within the boundaries of the very bylaws they pretended to uphold. He was going to take down the HOA committee. He was going to dismantle their fiefdom brick by painful brick. His first step was exhaustive, painstaking research. Mark dove deep into the HOA's bylaws, retrieving archived copies, cross-referencing every version, reading every single clause, every amendment, every obscure footnote. He didn't just skim, he devoured them, highlighted discrepancies, circled ambiguities, and noted every potential violation of state HOA laws, which he also meticulously studied. He discovered that the unapproved shrubbery rule was indeed vaguely worded, leaving room for arbitrary interpretation, and the tree removal mandate directly contradicted a clause, Article 6, Section C, Homeowners' Right to Property Improvements, about property owner rights regarding healthy, non-hazardous trees. More importantly, he found a glaring omission in their financial practices. The bylaws stipulated that all major financial expenditures exceeding $2,500, such as hiring an arborist for a community-wide assessment, or even just for history's supposed liability assessment, required a formal vote of the entire homeowner membership at a public meeting. There was no record of such a vote for any of the recent community improvement initiatives Arthur Vance had touted. This was a critical flaw, a gaping hole in their facade. Next, he sought allies. His first stop was Mrs. Henderson, still reeling from her grandson's truck incident, her eyes haunted by the lean threat. Mark listened patiently as she recounted her own string of fines, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. He showed her his own growing collection of threatening letters and the bylaws he'd meticulously annotated, pointing out the loopholes and violations. Mrs. Henderson's eyes, dulled by resignation and fear, began to sparkle with a flicker of hope. She knew others who had suffered, too ashamed or too intimidated to speak up. "There's the Millers," she whispered, "and old Mr. Davies, they've been put through the ringer." Slowly, carefully, a network formed. Mark and Mrs. Henderson started quietly knocking on doors, speaking to neighbors who had endured years of petty tyranny in hushed tones, often on their back porches or over coffee in a neutral space. The Johnsons fined for their kids' innocent chalk drawings on the driveway, defacing common property. The Millers, whose carefully cultivated perennial garden, a riot of color, was deemed non-compliant because it wasn't a traditional turf lawn. The elderly Mr. Davies, a widower, threatened with a lien for a loose gutter tile he couldn't afford to fix on his fixed income, despite repeated requests for HOA assistance with external maintenance. Everyone had a story, a simmering grievance, a thinly veiled anger simmering beneath the surface of suburban decorum. They were afraid, yes, but Mark offered them a path forward, a glimmer of hope that had been extinguished for too long. He organized clandestine meetings at the community park after dark, sometimes in the deserted parking lot of a nearby grocery store, away from the ubiquitous prying eyes of Agnes Periwinkle. Flashlights flickered under trees as they shared documents and whispered plans. During these increasingly frequent meetings, Mark shared his findings. He didn't just complain, he presented facts. He meticulously explained how the committee was operating not just outside the spirit, but often the explicit letter of their own bylaws. He explained the power of the annual general meeting, a legally mandated event they had largely ignored, and the potent possibility of a recall petition, a democratic tool enshrined in their own rules. He urged them tirelessly to document everything, every letter, every fine, every email, every phone call, every interaction. They created a shared, encrypted online drive, a digital repository that quickly grew into a damning archive of their collective misery and the HOA's undeniable transgressions. The sheer volume of evidence was shocking even to those who had experienced the tyranny firsthand. Their collective investigation unearthed more damning evidence than Mark could have imagined alone. Rick Dawson, the treasurer, had approved not just one, but multiple new landscaping and maintenance contracts with a company secretly owned by his brother-in-law, all without competitive bids and consistently at significantly inflated prices compared to market rates. This was a clear violation of fiduciary duty and a direct conflict of interest. Arthur Vance, the president, had used HOA funds to pay for extensive consultation fees to a shell company he secretly owned, disguised as vague community beautification assessments or strategic planning initiatives. These consultations involved no discernible work, yet drained tens of thousands of dollars from the community's reserves, directly benefiting Vance. Agnes Periwinkle, not to be outdone, had been selectively enforcing rules with chilling precision, targeting residents she personally disliked, often those who had dared to question her or Arthur in the past, while conveniently ignoring similar or even worse violations from her friends or those she wished to curry favor with. Mrs. Davies's loose gutter was a violation, but the Vances' own peeling paint on their shed went unnoticed for months. It was a racket, a carefully constructed system of self-enrichment and control, fraud, nepotism, abuse of power, embezzlement, all hidden behind a facade of suburban order and the iron-fisted enforcement of trivial rules. The Homeowners Committee, now numbering over 50 committed, furious members, each with their own story of injustice, decided their strategy: a multi-pronged, coordinated legal and procedural attack. First, a meticulously drafted, legally reviewed recall petition to remove Arthur Vance, Agnes Periwinkle, and Rick Dawson from their positions, citing specific bylaw violations and documented abuses. Second, a formal demand for a full independent financial audit of the HOA's books to be conducted by a neutral third-party firm. Third, a series of motions to amend the bylaws designed to limit the committee's arbitrary power, increase homeowner oversight, establish an independent grievance committee, and implement stricter financial transparency requirements, including mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts over a certain amount. The clock was ticking towards the annual general meeting, their chosen battlefield. The day of the annual general meeting arrived, thick with tension that was almost physically palpable. The community center, usually half empty, a dismal space for mundane reports, was packed to capacity. Every seat was taken, and dozens of homeowners stood along the walls, their faces grim, expectant. Arthur Vance, looking smug and supremely confident, began the meeting with his usual self-congratulatory speech, droning on about fiscal responsibility and community standards. Rick Dawson mumbled through the financial report, filled with vague line items and intentionally confusing jargon designed to obfuscate rather than inform. Agnes Periwinkle sat stiffly beside them, her gaze darting suspiciously around the room, her eyes narrowing as she recognized more and more unfamiliar faces. They sensed something was different, a tremor in the air, but dismissed it as mere disgruntled grumbling, something they were used to crushing. Then Mark stood up. His voice, steady and clear, resonated through the nervous murmuring that had accompanied Dawson's report. "Mr. President, members of the committee, fellow homeowners," he began, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I rise to present a motion." Arthur Vance, surprised by the direct public challenge, sneered, his lips curling. "State your motion, Mr. Jenkins, and make it quick. We have important business to attend to, unlike some." His condescending tone was designed to belittle. "My motion, Mr. President," Mark began again, his voice growing in confidence, not loud but firm, unwavering, "is a vote of no confidence in this committee, and a petition for your immediate recall, and that of Ms. Periwinkle and Mr. Dawson, from all positions on the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association Board." A ripple went through the room, then a collective, audible gasp. A few nervous coughs broke the silence. Arthur Vance's face, usually ruddy with assumed authority, went utterly white. "On what grounds, Mr. Jenkins?" he blustered, pounding his gavel once, feebly. "This is outrageous, unfounded. On the grounds of widespread abuse of power, blatant financial impropriety, selective and discriminatory enforcement of bylaws, and gross negligence in your fiduciary duties to this community," Mark declared, holding up a thick binder that seemed to hum with contained fury. "And I have the meticulously compiled evidence to prove every single accusation. Fellow homeowners, we have documented years of unfair fines, unapproved expenditures, blatant nepotism, and outright fraud that has systematically drained our community funds for personal gain and systematically eroded the peace of this neighborhood." He didn't just speak, he acted. As he spoke, he projected images onto the large screen at the front of the room, a powerful visual assault. First, photos of Mrs. Henderson's beat-up truck, followed by the $100 guest permit invoice, then copies of the subsequent lien threat. Next, copies of his own excessive rose growth fines, starkly juxtaposed with damning photos of Agnes Periwinkle's own sprawling, unfined hydrangeas that clearly extended into the common area. Then came the true bombshells, the damning financial documents. Scanned copies of the inflated landscaping contracts signed by Rick Dawson, the hidden ownership details connecting the contractor to his brother-in-law, receipts for vague consultation fees paid to Arthur Vance's shell company, followed by bank statements showing the money flowing directly into Vance's personal accounts. Detailed financial discrepancies from the HOA budget that painted a clear, undeniable picture of embezzlement, all verified by the preliminary findings of an independent forensic accountant they had secretly engaged. The room erupted. Whispers turned to shouts of outrage. Anger, long suppressed by fear and resignation, finally boiled over, rising like a tidal wave. Arthur Vance pounded his gavel repeatedly, a frantic, impotent sound against the roar of homeowner fury. "This is slander, baseless accusations. You have no proof," he roared, but his voice was completely drowned out by the cacophony. Mrs. Henderson, her small frame trembling but her voice remarkably firm, stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. "He's telling the truth, Arthur. You bullied me, you threatened my house, you took advantage of an old woman." One by one, other homeowners, emboldened by Mark's courage and the irrefutable evidence, rose from their seats, sharing their own stories, their voices gaining strength, their frustration palpable. The Johnsons recounted their children's humiliation over chalk drawings. The Millers detailed the destruction of their garden. The weight of collective experience, of years of accumulated grievances, crushed the committee's authority, exposing them for the petty tyrants they were. Rick Dawson began to sweat profusely, his eyes darting wildly towards the exit, his once slick hair now matted. Agnes Periwinkle sat rigid, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, her usual air of cold superiority completely gone, replaced by a desperate, trapped look. Mark then presented the meticulously prepared recall petition, signed by over 2/3 of the homeowners, a supermajority far exceeding the bylaw's minimum requirement. He presented the formal demand for a full independent forensic audit, already pre-approved by a majority vote of the homeowners they had secretly organized. The legal validity of their actions was unimpeachable. Agnes Periwinkle sat stiffly beside them, her gaze darting suspiciously around the room, her eyes narrowing as she recognized more and more unfamiliar faces. They sensed something was different, a tremor in the air, but dismissed it as mere disgruntled grumbling, something they were used to crushing. Then Mark stood up. His voice, steady and clear, resonated through the nervous murmuring that had accompanied Dawson's report. "Mr. President, members of the committee, fellow homeowners," he began, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I rise to present a motion." Arthur Vance, surprised by the direct public challenge, sneered, his lips curling. "State your motion, Mr. Jenkins, and make it quick. We have important business to attend to, unlike some." His condescending tone was designed to belittle. "My motion, Mr. President," Mark began again, his voice growing in confidence, not loud but firm, unwavering, "is a vote of no confidence in this committee, and a petition for your immediate recall, and that of Ms. Periwinkle and Mr. Dawson, from all positions on the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association Board." A ripple went through the room, then a collective audible gasp. A few nervous coughs broke the silence. Arthur Vance's face, usually ruddy with assumed authority, went utterly white. "On what grounds, Mr. Jenkins?" he blustered, pounding his gavel once, feebly. "This is outrageous, unfounded. On the grounds of widespread abuse of power, blatant financial impropriety, selective and discriminatory enforcement of bylaws, and gross negligence in your fiduciary duties to this community," Mark declared, holding up a thick binder that seemed to hum with contained fury. "And I have the meticulously compiled evidence to prove every single accusation. Fellow homeowners, we have documented years of unfair fines, unapproved expenditures, blatant nepotism, and outright fraud that has systematically drained our community funds for personal gain and systematically eroded the peace of this neighborhood." He didn't just speak, he acted. As he spoke, he projected images onto the large screen at the front of the room, a powerful visual assault. First, photos of Mrs. Henderson's beat-up truck, followed by the $100 guest permit invoice, then copies of the subsequent lien threat. Next, copies of his own excessive rose growth finds, starkly juxtaposed with damning photos of Agnes Periwinkle's own sprawling, unfined hydrangeas that clearly extended into the common area. Then came the true bombshells, the damning financial documents. Scanned copies of the inflated landscaping contracts signed by Rick Dawson, the hidden ownership details connecting the contractor to his brother-in-law, receipts for vague consultation fees paid to Arthur Vance's shell company, followed by bank statements showing the money flowing directly into Vance's personal accounts. Detailed financial discrepancies from the HOA budget that painted a clear, undeniable picture of embezzlement, all verified by the preliminary findings of an independent forensic accountant they had secretly engaged. The room erupted. Whispers turned to shouts of outrage. Anger, long suppressed by fear and resignation, finally boiled over, rising like a tidal wave. Arthur Vance pounded his gavel repeatedly, a frantic, impotent sound against the roar of homeowner fury. "This is slander, baseless accusations, you have no proof," he roared, but his voice was completely drowned out by the cacophony. Mrs. Henderson, her small frame trembling but her voice remarkably firm, stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. "He's telling the truth, Arthur. You bullied me, you threatened my house, you took advantage of an old woman." One by one, other homeowners, emboldened by Mark's courage and the irrefutable evidence, rose from their seats, sharing their own stories, their voices gaining strength, their frustration palpable. The Johnsons recounted their children's humiliation over chalk drawings. The Millers detailed the destruction of their garden. The weight of collective experience, of years of accumulated grievances, crushed the committee's authority, exposing them for the petty tyrants they were. Rick Dawson began to sweat profusely, his eyes darting wildly towards the exit, his once slick hair now matted. Agnes Periwinkle sat rigid, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, her usual air of cold superiority completely gone, replaced by a desperate, trapped look. Mark then presented the meticulously prepared recall petition, signed by over 2/3 of the homeowners, a supermajority far exceeding the bylaw's minimum requirement. He presented the formal demand for a full independent forensic audit, already pre-approved by a majority vote of the homeowners they had secretly organized. The legal validity of their actions was unimpeachable. Arthur Vance, seeing his absolute power crumbling into dust around him, tried one last desperate tactic, a final pathetic grasp at control. "This meeting is out of order. I declare this meeting adjourned," he shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. But it was too late. General Marcus Thorne, a retired military man whose stern but fair reputation preceded him, and a homeowner himself who had quietly observed the entire proceeding from the back of the room, stood up. His imposing presence, even in civilian clothes, commanded instant respect and attention. "Mr. Vance," he stated, his voice calm but resonating with an unshakable authority that cut through the remaining din, "according to Article 4, Section 3B of our bylaws, a recall petition, once formally presented with the required signatures, triggers an immediate vote by the membership. This vote cannot be unilaterally adjourned or postponed by the President. The floor's open for the vote. Proceed, Mr. Jenkins." The vote was swift and overwhelmingly unanimous. Hands shot up into the air, a vast unified sea of raised arms signifying a collective desire for change, for justice, for peace. The three members of the committee, Arthur Vance, Agnes Periwinkle, and Rick Dawson, were recalled on the spot, their reign of terror officially over, ended by the very people they had oppressed. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded the meeting. This was not a nervous silence, but a profound quiet of shock, of relief, of pure, unadulterated triumph. The committee members were stunned, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Rick Dawson slunk out a side door, his head down, quickly followed by a humiliated Agnes Periwinkle who refused to make eye contact with anyone. Arthur Vance, his face a mask of incandescent fury and utter defeat, remained for a moment, glaring at Mark, then grabbed his gavel and stormed out, leaving it clattering uselessly on the table behind him. In the ensuing days, the independent audit confirmed what Mark and the homeowners had suspected, and then some: significant embezzlement and egregious misuse of funds by Arthur Vance and Rick Dawson, along with numerous contractual irregularities. Legal action was swiftly initiated by the newly formed legitimate HOA board, leading to criminal charges, substantial fines, and hefty restitution orders against both men. Agnes Periwinkle, while not facing criminal charges for financial impropriety, was publicly disgraced and effectively ostracized from the community she had once tyrannized, her reputation irreparably shattered. New elections were promptly held, characterized by a renewed sense of community spirit and genuine democratic participation. Mark Jenkins, reluctant at first, preferring to stay behind the scenes, was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, urged on by his grateful neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, her spirit revived, proudly accepted the role of secretary, her meticulous notes now used for transparency instead of oppression. Other trusted neighbors, representatives of the new collaborative spirit, filled the remaining positions on the board. Their first order of business: amending the bylaws to ensure greater transparency, accountability, and genuine homeowner representation. The tree removal mandate was immediately rescinded, and a community-wide vote was initiated to protect all healthy old trees. Mark's magnificent oak tree stood tall and proud, a symbol of their victory. The community of Willow Creek Estates began to heal. The pervasive fear that had stifled creativity and neighborly interaction dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie, shared responsibility, and true ownership. Neighbors started talking again, helping each other, organizing genuine community events, creating the vibrant, peaceful community that the HOA brochures had falsely promised all along. Mark never thought of it as revenge in the petty, vindictive sense. It was justice. It was accountability. It was taking back what was rightfully theirs: their homes, their peace, their fundamental right to live in a community governed by fairness, not tyranny. The HOA committee had gotten its punishment, and the homeowners of Willow Creek Estates finally had their peace.